Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth.
And hello, everybody, and welcome to Presence. I am Doug King. Glad to be with you here in this podcast. I'm going to start a series. As you have seen, most likely in the newsletter, the title of this series is going to be The Biblical Narrative, Integral Consciousness, and Regeneration. That's an interesting title. Well, I'll get to it in a bit here. This will be a series. We're going to go into a number of things and their application to our current life conditions on planet Earth and how we are all navigating and going forward. But there's no doubt about one thing. A global conversation is absolutely happening. The conversation is a manifestation of human consciousness that is currently evolving into a world-centric awareness. This is nothing less than a reflection of the all-in-all God that is described in the biblical narrative. It is nothing less than the interconnectivity of all things and the interconnectivity of all people. The world today, for the most part, not everyone, but for the most part, the world today is appalled at the predatory actions against Ukraine. And this is an example of global thinking that is becoming far more pervasive on the planet and that is moving toward unity and peace. That's great news. Well, in this series, I'm going to be discussing the convergence process. What is the convergence process? It also is happening. And it's a convergence of all fields of understanding as part of an all-in-all unitive narrative. So people in physics, biology, and integral consciousness, etc., are now creating a new unitive narrative. And this narrative we're proposing integrates beautifully with the biblical narrative. Presence is going to continue to investigate and present the numerous ways that the biblical narrative is converging with other narratives on a global scale, and thus our tagline, a global conversation for a new earth. So I'm going to begin this convergent conversation with a term that's used only 2 times in the entire biblical narrative. I'll be showing how Jesus, Paul, and integral philosophers like Ken Wilber, who I'll talk about a little bit more in a second here, and many others in integral consciousness and philosophy and so forth, how they are all, yes, Jesus, Paul, and all people in these fields are now telling the same story. So we're going to continue this conversation in the future, I can tell you that, because we're going to investigate the world of physics, we're going to investigate the world of biology. They have their own narratives. But I'm not going to be presenting what I think physics is or biology is. I will be talking with experts from those fields. And for example, in the last newsletter, I brought up the fact that I'm participating in this thing called evolutionary leaders. And within that, I'm in a synergy circle among many synergy circles. And the title of our group, so to speak, is Integral and Holistic Cosmologies. And that's holistic, W-H-O-L. Holistic, as in the whole, the allness of. And one of the people who's on the liaison committee for that group, and I'm on the liaison committee, is Dr. Jude Currivan. She is a physicist and mathematician from the UK. She's written a great book, Well, I'll be getting to the global conversation of science and spirituality with people like her and others. And it is an incredible conversation that's going on now. The convergence of science and spirituality. So a lot more on that later. That's a trailer. Those are the coming attractions. That's where we'll be going. But as I noted earlier, today is the biblical narrative, integral consciousness, and regeneration. Now, this word, regeneration, as I said, is only used 2 times in the narrative. One time, it's used by Jesus. The other time, it's used by Paul. So, let's go through these. Let's take a look at how they present the same ideas and principles as those that are found in the field of integral consciousness. Let's start, first of all, with the work of Ken Wilber, who is part of the Synergy Circle that I'm participating in. And that's why I'm bringing up Ken. Look, there are a lot of philosophers and people who have written great material and provided great content in the field of integral consciousness. I bring up Ken Wilber because he's in my group, and he's been kind enough to see me on a couple of occasions at his place, very gracious and kind man. Well, Ken, as others, talk about the evolution of human consciousness in terms of this trajectory. Ken said that looking at history, we can see that humanity and the consciousness of humanity has moved from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric. So when we use these integral models, we know that the early levels start out with archaic, which is the egocentric, self-centered, I've got to stay alive and survive on the planet consciousness that is the foundation of everything that determines whether we have anything else to worry about or not, whether we survive. But when you move from that egocentric, you move immediately into the tribal era. And that tribal era then moves into other levels and stages that are actually just nothing less than iterations related to the ethnocentric consciousness of identity. The tribal, we can see very clearly it's ethnocentric. But, even when you move into the warrior, the next era, the ethnocentric tribal means something like a feudal kingdom. And when you move into the traditional mode, that ethnocentric meaning becomes institutional, or it's the empire. And so that becomes ethnocentric. Now, the evolutionary leap that's being experienced by many is the movement from ethnocentric into world-centric consciousness and the understanding of identity as interconnected and universal. So let's go through these 2 uses. I'm going to start with Jesus in Matthew 19. Here's Jesus talking to the apostles. He looks at them and he says, I'm saying to you this, that you who have followed me, in the regeneration, when the Son of Man will sit on the throne of his glory, you also will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, I'm going to talk about what he's saying here about regeneration, but first, I have to address the last part of what Jesus said about the apostles sitting on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. The fact of the matter is that the biggest obstacle I have to overcome when I'm talking to people who are in global conversations from all sectors of understanding is the Bible. many people have experienced the biblical narrative and some of its material like fingernails on a blackboard. I've sat here in our Atlanta location and talked to pastors who are trying to figure out where they may go next, who are discouraged and looking for a way to reinterpret this story so that its meaning continues in their lives. And they tell me, they've literally sat there and looked at me, some, not all, but some have said to me that there are literally parts of the biblical narrative they can't even read. And one of those concepts is judgment. So when you got something in a verse that says they're going to sit on 12 thrones, they're going to judge the 12 tribes of Israel, man, you're talking about you're going to have to get into historical context, and we will do that later. But I'm bringing it up because the concept of judgment, my gosh, is there anybody on the planet that doesn't understand the biblical narrative, the Bible, and judgment? So the question is, how in the world do we talk about unity and interconnectedness and have a story that's got the judgment day coming? Look outside Christianity. I Googled movies that had in the title Judgment Day. Now, the first one I thought of, why I did it, was the first thing I thought of was the one by Arnold Schwarzenegger, a movie I never saw. But he was in a movie, and the title was Terminator 2, Judgment Day. And then I looked, and there were all kinds of movies, songs, books, about Judgment Day. So is there anybody on the planet who hasn't been told or know about it? And this is why we're going to discuss it. And we're also going to see how applying a second-tier lens to this material dramatically changes the meaning and understanding that has been drilled in the head of human beings for the last 2,000 years. Because the last 2,000 years have been dominated by traditional, modern, and postmodern interpretations of life conditions. And when you apply a second tier, that's why it's an evolutionary leap. It changes the meaning dramatically. And the fact is that judgment is a necessary part of revealing universal God identity and the interconnectivity of all. How in the world can that be? You have to stay tuned. That'll be in future episodes, coming part of this series. But I'm starting here with regeneration, and let's go back to what Jesus said. The apostles and followers with him were participating in a process known as the regeneration. The regeneration. It was happening in their day, in their time, in that historical context. Now we come to Paul, and he wrote a letter to Titus. And in that letter, and if you're studying this, those of you that study from the biblical narrative, it's in the 3rd chapter of Titus, the 4th and 5th verse. So Paul's writing this letter, and he says to Titus, "But when the goodness and loving kindness of our God appeared, he saved us, not because of works done by us in righteousness, but according to his own mercy, by the washing of regeneration and the renewal of the Holy Spirit." So Paul is using the word regeneration, but look at the language he associates with regeneration here. He says God is loving, God is kind, God saves, God is mercy. This is the nature of nature. This is the nature of the consciousness that birthed this universe, and that is the source of the new unitive narrative that is now being revealed, a narrative of which we are now becoming more and more conscious. So, when we talk about judgment, we're also going to talk about the language of Paul here and how in the world you can have concepts like goodness and loving kindness and mercy in the context of some type of judgment. But we'll see that all this goes hand in hand, and the important part of where I am in this very first introductory discussion that ties in with integral consciousness and the different synergy circles that are forming all over this planet to have this discussion of a new unitive narrative is this word regeneration. What is its role and function in the place of the narrative? What is meant by it? Well, first of all, the Greek word regeneration is the word polygenesis. Polygenesis. This is a word that comes from the root genao or genos, which can mean birth or birthday or the act of birthing or generation or genealogy. So when you're talking about genealogy and you're talking about regeneration, you're literally saying that it means to regenealogize. Try saying that 3 times real fast. Regenealogize. So what does this mean? And in what way do we tie this to the concepts, such as the one I identified with Ken Wilber, and this movement from ethnocentric to world-centric? What is the biblical narrative saying with regard to this integrated message? Well, first of all, if you look at the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, both of them start their Gospels with the genealogy of Jesus. Now, Matthew goes back to Abraham. That's because Matthew's audience, primarily people from Israel, and that's how they trace their lineage. And so he goes back to Abraham. If he wants to set the stage for how Jesus came on the scene, he comes through that genealogy all the way back to Abraham. Luke, on the other hand, his genealogy goes back to Adam. And that's because Luke traveled with Paul, and Paul was the guy who went to the Gentiles. And so Paul spoke more in terms of the universal, all people, not just Israel, but Gentiles as well, Jew and Gentile. Luke knew that. Luke knew that it was Paul who talked about Jesus being the last Adam, because Adam is archaic Adam, who sets the stage with the egocentric consciousness as told by the narrative. So genealogy was identity, but it was an identity connected to biological form. It was a form. And genealogy was critical to an understanding of one's identity. As a matter of fact, to this day, let's face it, we're all interested in our own genealogy. Here in the United States, for those that live here, I don't know how many other countries have Ancestry.com or use it. I've used it myself, and to see what the different countries were that were part of my ancestry. And so why do we do that? Because tribal comes right after archaic, and those are our 2 strongest instinctual drives, our tribe. If it's my biological tribe, as I've said before, if a phone rings and there's something that's happened to somebody in my biological tribe and they're in the hospital, I stop what I'm doing. Nothing else matters. I'm on the way to the hospital. That's how strong our tribal instinct is. Well, the genealogy of Israel relates to what? Her 12 tribes. That's where tribal begins in the biblical narrative, the 12 tribes of Israel. And there's nothing wrong with tribal identity in that sense. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with my biological tribe. And I belong to a lot of other tribes as well. We could describe any group as a tribe. My football team is a tribe. We put on the colors of our war paint, and we go to war with all the other tribes out there every Saturday. So all this is a part of our lives. Tribes played role and function. Judah was the tribe that David came from, and all the kings of Israel were of that lineage in Judah. The priest and the high priest all came from the tribe of Levi. Everything came from that Levitical lineage. So as we go through this, we think about tribes and how they evolved, and the fact that the warrior stage or level came next, and that's because as tribes began to encounter each other, they experienced the hostility of what? The hostility of separation consciousness. Your tribe's different than mine. You see things different. You have a volcano god. We have an ocean god. On and on we go. Now, later on, at the end of the story, Paul's going to add to the story by writing a letter to people who lived in Ephesus, and he's going to say that one of the roles and functions of Jesus was to take down the wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile. So for Paul, this is one way to describe the entirety of the human population, was to use Jew and Gentile as a way or a perspective to describe it, because he's coming from Israel, and Jew and Gentile was what he grew up with as a way to show the separation, the tribal separation of identity. So this is what happens. Tribes encounter each other, and Paul said you end up with walls of hostility. So tribes were based on genealogy, and this comes from this same root word, genealogy. Only Jesus is talking about they were in a process in the first century of re-genealogizing. Remember Nicodemus? He was puzzled when Jesus said, you have to be born again. Can I enter again into my mother's womb? That's all he understood about genealogy. But Jesus was introducing a new concept regarding birth and regeneration. Look at Paul writing a letter to the people in Rome and talking about baptism and them becoming a new creature, a new person. All this is about identity. You cannot have a new unitive narrative if you see anyone as other. You're regressing back into tribal thinking when it comes to identity. Does my biological ancestry have a role and function in my life, and my family have a role and function, and different groups that I belong to have role and function? Yes, they do. But they're not my identity. So note also that Paul's saying not only is it not genealogical from the standpoint of biological birth, but he's saying this also applies to a tribal understanding of identity that comes by works of righteousness. This is what Paul grew up with, that it's what you do that determines your identity. That identity is not innate, but in fact, Paul saw that it was, and that it's innate because it relates to one thing, and that's source. And what is source? Source is the consciousness that manifested all things that exist. Genealogy is human doing, or humans as source. Works of righteousness comes back to the human as the source of identity. So it's tied to genealogy by Paul. This is why he said, when he wrote to the Galatian people, that Jesus was born of a woman, there's your genealogy, biological, and born under the law. There's your other form attachment, tribal attachment. Genealogy and law were identities based on human doing. Regeneration was a transform process that was delivering humanity from the bondage of form attachment regarding identity. Today, We have Russia, a really big tribe, trying to dominate a smaller one. This is regression consciousness all the way back into warrior level. That's why the whole world is so appalled. For all of our problems that we have today, we're not saying that we don't have any problems in our country or with our thinking or with our family's thinking or our personal thinking, but what we are saying is that there are many ways in which we have absolutely evolved and advanced. So when you see levels of consciousness that are dysfunctional in their harm to others, it is appalling. And as we've said many times, this separation thinking is alive and well in religion. Father Abraham, what did he become over the last few millennia? He became a figure of identity for 3 world religions. 3 separated religions. Rather than becoming the beginning of a story that eventually transcends genealogy and all forms, including religions. And that's been the President's message here, as everybody knows, for some time. That's the way we've seen and understood it. We see Abraham in a different light. My experience within Christianity is that denominations are tribes. And if those denominations are still in blue V-meme fundamentalism, they are likely to be at war with other denominations about who is the correct denomination. As they evolve, they eventually agree to put down their weapons and respect each other's boundaries, and so we would have interfaith, which is an advantage. It's better than blue meme fundamentalistic war. Interfaith is a sign of green postmodernity, the desire to get along. But at the end of the day, the tribes are still divided, they're still denominated, they're still separated. Genealogy is the biblical narrative's way of showing how the separation paradigm of consciousness began in the first world. Because there was a first world, there was a world to come. Tribal works beautifully when it's seen as role and function, but not identity. The use of the law works beautifully in role and function as a guide for our actions on the planet. Torah itself means guide, but it separates when it's used for identity, because then we have councils and synods and patriarchal groups that dominate, especially the Christian religion from which I come and speak. And they set themselves up as the judges, and here is judgment, but not biblically used, as we'll see in the future. And it separates. So people attached to religions, priesthood, lineages, gurus, and even spiritual teachers, and they form tribes. And jealousy often arises. Whose teacher is most important? Whose lineage is most important? Whose denomination is the right denomination? I've literally sat in meetings with people from different tribal backgrounds religiously, and in some cases heard arguments break out about whose lineage taught a particular principle first. You can feel the tension as people draw back inside. This is the way the instinct works. The jealousy works. And the separation comes as a result. So regeneration is a transformative process. There was a big birthing process that was going on, not only in the individual, there was a birthing process going on in the cosmos. And that's going to take us down the road into cosmology. A new cosmology was coming, and the biblical narrative calls it a new heaven and earth. And this new heaven and earth is just simply the movement into second-tier consciousness. It's a transcendent include because it includes the heavens and the earth of Genesis 1:1 and all the beauty of the creation of this universe and the planet Earth and all that's in. But it transcends our way of navigating it, seeing it, and relating to all others on this beautiful planet, because that movement, that evolution happens within our consciousness, our understanding, and that is a movement from ethnocentric to world-centric. So I'm going to talk a lot more about genealogy, generation, the cosmology of it in future episodes as we go forward. But let me just end on this note. As I said previously, I'm in a synergy circle with Ken Wilber. So I'm sitting here doing this and I'm thinking to myself, if Jesus and Paul were here at our place in Atlanta and they were sitting out at our fire pit and they were having a cigar together with Ken Wilber, they had this discussion, I think Jesus and Paul would give Ken Wilber a high five and they'd say, yeah, this is the unitive narrative that's going to connect everybody's narratives that are on a second tier, new heaven and earth, interconnected, unitive narrative. This is the way it's going to happen. And we're on the way to it. And it's going to take us to places that far exceed anything we've experienced so far. It's an evolutionary leap, a huge jump forward. So, that's how we're starting. Thanks for joining. I'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.